pick up your lesson sheets, you can open those to the questions on Lesson 11. I'm going to run through those real quick with you this morning, and then move into Lesson 12 together with you this morning. We're talking about portraits of discipleship, and we're talking about the importance of recognizing what it really means to be a disciple. We've talked throughout our study over the past almost 3 months. We're almost done with the series over the last 3 months, but this is very important for us to recognize. It's one thing to call ourselves disciples. It's one thing to identify ourselves as such. It's another thing to live up to that and strive to make sure that we fulfill all the different characteristics that Jesus would describe for disciples. And so that's been our effort throughout this particular study, and we continue to do that over the next couple of weeks as we finish up this series. But we do want to very quickly talk about these answers to these questions, because I know you probably sit at home, hopefully, and spend some time answering them. So we've been talking in our last lesson, Lesson 11, was about what two elements, if you will, that we are to be. Salt and light. Okay. And when we talk about salt and light, we're talking really about the first question, and that's what subject? Influence, right? How it is we use our influence, how it is that we're able to encourage others through being light and salt within our families, within our communities, and within our different friends. So what would you, or how would you simply define influence? What is it?
The power to affect others.
Okay. And I think, Jim, really that's in a nutshell what it is. It's the ability to affect other people. And that can be done in basically what two planes, if you will, that we talk about it in. We can affect them positively or negatively, or good and bad, right? We have an ability, and we talked about the fact that no one lives to themselves. Everybody's got some connection to somebody somewhere, even though there may be times where we'd like to just kind of disappear. But it's important for us to recognize that we're connected to other people, and we're going to affect other people one way or the other. So why not do that for good? Why not use those opportunities for positive things rather than discouraging things? But we all have an influence, so let's use it in the right ways. How does Peter then describe Jesus to the household of Cornelius in Acts 10, verse 38?
He went about doing good.
Okay, so he went about doing good. In other words, that his thought processes, his character, his continual effort was good things. And so we shouldn't think about good things in the sense of let's do one here today, and then maybe a couple weeks from now we'll do something else that's good. A month later we'll do something else that's good, and maybe 2 months after that we'll think about doing something else that's good. What we should be is people who are continually looking for opportunities to do good, because that's what the Savior did. And as disciples of Jesus, as followers of His, that should be our mindset. Describe how disciples are to act as preservatives in this sinful world. Okay, that was that whole description, or part of that description of being salt. And there was a reference back to the Old Testament times. How many would it have taken to save Sodom and Gomorrah at the very end of the conversation between God and Abraham? 10, right? If they could have found 10 salt tablets, if you will, at the end of that discussion, Sodom and Gomorrah could have been saved. 10 souls could have preserved all of Sodom and Gomorrah. And so there's several imageries you can get from that. We talked about several of them in our study. But the point being, Christians, in a sense, allow for God or give Him a reason to continue to preserve this world. You and I need to continue to be salt. Because as long as we have opportunity to be salt, we have opportunity to influence others for good things. And so we preserve the world in that sense. Describe the kind of flavor that disciples are to provide to the world. That was kind of an interesting way to ask that. But
Yeah, I guess it's salt and light.
okay, again, this whole idea of being salt and light. What else did you might have think of though when you read those texts?
To be able to comfort
Okay.
others.
When we help and comfort other people, we have an ability to affect them for good. And being light and salt is not always just things that we say, although it can involve things we say. But being light and salt isn't always about what we say. Many times it's about what we do. And some of the best light and salt that we could ever be is the things that we do for others and the way we help and comfort in challenging times.
You should read
Yeah, yeah,
Great people see you rejoicing, that's your soul life right there.
absolutely.
That helps come to be for everybody, doesn't it?
Right, right. Anybody. And when you do that, who gets glorified? God does. God does, and that's the point. What does Proverbs 22:1 say about the value of our influence?
Better than silver and gold.
That's right. Sorry about that. A good name, he said, a good name is better than riches. We overemphasize the value of that, don't we? We overemphasize the value of riches. And we almost make it the end-all of all things. If a man is rich, then he's got it going for him, right? He can have anything and everything he wants. One of the great things Jesus does in his teachings about his kingdom and the citizens within it, he de-emphasizes the value of monetary things. You remember even conversations Jesus has with some when he talked about how it's harder for a rich man to get into heaven or into the kingdom of heaven than it is for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. And the emphasis of that was the people said, well, then who can be saved, right? If their concept was rich men can do anything they wanted to do. Has that concept changed? No, not really, has it? It hasn't changed even since Bible times. Even in our modern world, we have this image that rich people get away with whatever they want, right? And they do whatever they want. Jesus says, not so in my kingdom. Riches don't have that same value. We need to emphasize reputation over wealth in our relationship with Jesus. Describe some ways that a disciple can lose his good influence. He said use Scripture to support it. Okay, so we fail to, that's horrible, sorry about that, you know what that says. We fail to practice what we preach. What passage was that in? That was Romans 2, right? That was Romans 2. What else?
Compromise.
Compromise, okay, where was that? That was
2:5.
That was Galatians 2, right? That was Galatians 2. What else?
I'm friends with the world.
Okay, we can love the world too much. And that was James 4:4. And I have 2 Timothy 2. Am I correct in that? Anybody double check me. I'm just going off my notes. I think that has the same connection to that idea. What else did you write down?
2 Peter 2:15.
Okay, what did it?
Forsaking the right way.
Yeah. So 2 Peter 2 reminds us of forsaking that right way and getting off the path.
You know, in Romans 2:18, I like the way they say that. It says, who holds the truth in unrighteousness.
Yeah.
You know, you can be a Christian holding the truth, but you do it in an unrighteous way.
Yeah. The same value doesn't come. Absolutely. It's not the kind of influence God would want. And it's not something we necessarily talk a lot about in this particular study, but it's worth noting that having the truth isn't the end all. The manner in which we use that truth and the manner in which we share that truth is just as important. There's enough. The Bible says having our speech always with grace seasoned with salt. Interesting relationship here. But it's a reminder to us that God doesn't only emphasize what we say, but God has also emphasized the manner in which we go about telling and sharing that truth. And our influence to be salt and light will be dramatically affected by how we say things. Whether we like that idea or not, it's the truth because it comes from God's Word. And we've got to maybe take a little more caution and a little more thought in how we present truth.
You can't force people to accept
Yeah,
it.
we have to be very cautious that we don't forget that element. We can have all the truth there is all day long, but if we're just force feeding people, what value is there? What value is there in that? I feel good about myself, right? That's the mindset of folks when we do that. Is, well, I feel good about myself because I told it the truth without any thought to the damage I was actually doing because of the manner.
They went away, they don't accept it.
Yeah. So there's a lot of things when it comes to being light and salt that we can consider. What does Jesus say about the salt that loses its flavor? Okay, and we kind of spun on that because that's a phrase and not a kind one, right? That someone might say of another. They're good for nothing. But in some senses, that's what Jesus says. If we are salt, But we've lost our potency. If we refuse to be the kind of salt that Jesus would want us to be, then unfortunately the result of that is we become good or nothing. We bring no benefit to the table.
Lose their influence.
Yeah. In fact, he says that kind of salt does what? What do they do with it?
Throw it out.
Throw it where, by the way?
Out the street.
Out the street to be trodden underfoot. You don't even want to throw it in your yard, right? Because it will just continuous destructive path there. It becomes no value but to just give some traction to somebody's feet as they trod it under. How do faithful disciples create a spiritual thirst in others and draw them out of spiritual darkness?
One way, right way to live.
Okay, the manner in which we live, and for lack of a better description, what we want to attempt to do is make Christianity palatable to people. People ought to leave our presence wanting to be a child of God, not questioning whether they would ever want to be that, or why would I ever consider that. But we ought to have that kind of influence where folks would want to thirst and become, and thirst after the things that we have. And if we walk around downtrodden, frustrated, angry, just negative people continually, then that's not the manner in which Jesus would want to be portrayed to the world. I'm convinced, and I say this to myself, I don't just say this to you, but I'm convinced that we do as much damage to the cause of Christ with our attitudes than we ever do with teaching something that's erroneous or an error. We can be just as destructive with the disposition that we take into the world and the attitude that we take into the world as if we had been teaching error. And that's the point I'm trying to make. We have to be careful we don't leave people in our way wondering, why would I ever want to be a Christian if that's the result? And that's a challenge all of us have. How's the life of a faithful disciple like the shining sun? Okay, it begins at dawn, right?
It's brighter and brighter.
And that's right, it just keeps going throughout the day. As the sun kind of starts to illuminate, positive influence we have keeps growing.
That's the path, that's what you see.
Yeah.
We're to be the reflection of Jesus.
Right. We talked extensively about that Wednesday, about how God and Jesus are the source of the light, and we're the mirrors. We get the opportunity, the great privilege of reflecting it.
And even after the sun goes down, we still have light.
Yeah. What do men do when they see our good works? Glorify God. That's the intent. They glorify God. What do men do when they see us commit sin? God is what? What's the word? Yeah, he's blaspheming. He's blaspheming. It's a challenge, and that doesn't mean we're going to be perfect and never make a mistake. But we need to strive very diligently that people never speak disparagingly of our God because of something I did. And that's hard. And again, we're not going to be perfect. But it's a reality you and I need to accept, that if we claim to be followers of Jesus, then people are going to naturally, in some ways, be inclined to see what we do and attribute it to Jesus. And that's just the reality of the circumstance. So let's embrace that fact and do what we can to be the kind of influence, be the salt and light that God would want us to
So
be.
watching you every minute to try to catch you
Yeah,
something.
yeah. Any leftover thoughts about salt and light before we move on? Okay, lesson 12. Not to insult your intelligence, but how many of you, and I won't just think in your heads, I guess I won't ask for a show of hands. When you saw the title of this, did anybody say, what in the world is he talking about? Not me, but the author of the book. I'm going to put it on him. I didn't write this material.
That looks like what
Yeah,
you're thinking.
right. It is not... The academic side of preachers can come out sometimes. And there is a form of teaching they call apologetics. And then basically the idea is that we at times are left in a defensive mode where we have to defend, apologize for, not in the sense that we did something wrong, but to defend the truth and defend the legitimacy of Christianity, defend the legitimacy of our belief in Jesus, defend the legitimacy of God as the Creator. And that general theological process is called apologetics. And that's what he's talking about in this text. Really, the best approach is to simply accept a more common expression that's stated there in 1 Peter 3, verse 15, when he said, "But sanctify the Lord God in your hearts and be always ready to give a what?" Well, I covered it up almost. To give a defense, okay? That's a word we understand a little better. To give a defense to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you with meekness and fear. Not apologize in the sense, again, that God did something wrong or we did something wrong, but the original Greek words that we get the word defense from come from the same words we get the word apologize from. And that's why this connection between the two. But for our purposes, I think we'll stick with the word defense. It makes more sense to all of us. And that's what we're talking about in this lesson.
To be able to answer from Scripture.
Yeah. And to give a legitimate defense for the hope that's within us. Sometimes, and I don't want to get too far ahead of myself in this study, but sometimes we get this imagery that text is challenging us to be able to give an answer for everything that we might ever encounter in religious conversation. And that's not what the text said. The text says, I need to be able to give somebody a reason for the hope that is within me. Why do I believe in Jesus? Why do I believe that I'll be saved in Him? Why do you have this hope and conviction? Why have you put your faith and confidences in this Creator? Why is it that I believe in the Lord? Doesn't mean that I'm going to have a ready answer for every single religious concept or thought that might come down the road. But it means I'm ready to tell anybody at any point why I'm a believer. And to be honest with you, that's a challenge enough within itself. Sometimes I wonder, do you have an answer for that? Do I have an answer for that? If somebody was to walk up to me and say, because here's why I say that. How many of you have ever been asked that? Once in a while, maybe, but you know, we're not often put on the defensive mechanism about defending why I'm a believer. I don't know, but maybe 2 or 3 times I could conjure in my own mind in my whole entire life where somebody called into question why I believed in something. Now, there may be multitudes of times where I'm ridiculed for what I believe, but we're not always called to defend it. But Jesus says through the Apostle Peter, we need to be ready to do that. We need to be ready to give an answer for why it is we believe in the Savior.
Is that the same word, apologize? It's not, as we use it today.
Well,
We don't have to apologize because we are Christians.
Right, and that's why I'm saying let's just get away from that word because it's going to complicate it for us in our study. He's not talking about, the word does not mean, from its Greek origins, it does not always mean apologize for something you did or said wrong, or that you ought to be embarrassed for being a Christian. It's more of a word that lends itself to the idea of defending something. And so we're going to stick with the word defend, just for sake of clarity in our discussion. And so that's exactly what the Apostle Paul did. I want you to go over Philippians chapter 1. Philippians chapter 1, verse 16. It's an interesting conversation. I don't know how deep I want to go into this today, but we'll travel for a moment here. Philippians 1 is an interesting text to me because what Paul does here is he says that people talk about Jesus for what purposes? For both good and bad or wrong reasons, okay? And Paul says if Jesus is being discussed, that's a what? That's always a what? It's always a good thing, right? He said some do it out of envy, some do it out of the wrong motivations, some don't do it out of the proper love for Jesus, some are confused. But if Jesus is under discussion, that can always lead to something that's good. And so Paul, though he doesn't necessarily approve, he's not saying he approves of people who preach out of envy or say things for the wrong reasons, but he is saying he's okay with the idea that Jesus is under discussion. To give you a more modern example of what I'm talking about, I found an interesting read after last night's Democratic debate. They talked about how the fact that how many times Trump had been referenced, and they said Trump was smiling the whole time, even though it was all negative, even though they pounded him the whole time. He was smiling. Why? Because he's being what? Being talked about, right? Free advertisement. Free advertisement. Okay? As long as you stay in the conversation, you have an opportunity. If we remove Jesus from the conversations, if people just quit talking about him altogether, that is a bad place to be. That is worse. Having Jesus never talked about is worse than having him talked about for the wrong reasons by some people, Paul says. And so, if Jesus is under conversation, if people are discussing him, then good things can happen from that, even though individuals may have the wrong motives behind that. With that thought, now think about what he said. Verse 15. Some indeed preach Christ even of envy and strife, and some also of goodwill, positive and negative reasons. The one do it of love, knowing that I am set for the defense of the gospel. But the other proclaim Christ of faction, not sincerely, thinking to raise up affliction for me in my bonds. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and therein I rejoice, yea, and will rejoice. Paul appreciates a very basic, fundamental fact, and that is you can't encourage anybody to appreciate Jesus in a positive light if he's not being talked about at all. And so Paul says, there's some bad guys out there talking about Jesus in the wrong ways, and maybe even saying the wrong things about him. But if he's being talked about, good things can happen. Now, on a personal level, what does Paul say about himself in that gospel message? Back in verse 16. I'm ready to what? I'm ready to defend. Okay. If people want to ask me why I believe, there may be those who preach out of pretense. There may be those who preach out of the wrong reasons. There may be some who aren't out of love. But if they come and ask me about why it is I'm preaching the gospel, he says, I'm ready to defend it. And that's the mindset you and I need to have. I need to be ready to defend what I believe, why I believe it, and to defend the Savior and the gospel message that he presents to us. Paul recognized the importance of that, and so should I. And yes, sometimes Jesus can be spoken of in confusing ways by me. Sometimes folks won't accurately depict who he is and what he's about and what he's actually taught or said. But if the conversation is going, I have an opportunity to shed truth and light, and I have an opportunity to defend what the gospel actually teaches on some subject. And so though it may be disappointing, though truth needs to come to light, though truth needs to come to the top, don't always think it as just completely horrible when folks miss something about the Savior. Because if the conversation's there, opportunity's there.
Is that always a level of defense?
Okay. No, and that's a great study within itself, Gary, but it's not. You know, sometimes defending the gospel, again, can be about influence and action and purpose and living the standard to demonstrate to the world what Christianity is really about and citizens of his kingdom. So defending the gospel can happen in a variety of ways. Any other thoughts?
People are still doing the same thing today as they did back then, out of verse 16.
Let me share with you Acts chapter 17. It's in your notes. He said, Paul went into a synagogue of the Jews, and for 3 Sabbaths How many Sabbaths you have in a week? One. Okay, so we're talking about over a 3-week stretch, right? So for 3 Sabbaths, reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and giving evidence that the Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead, and saying, this Jesus who I am proclaiming to you is the Christ. Now, little quick, valuable lesson I think we gain from that. Where was Paul when he did that? Again, he's in a synagogue. Synagogues are houses of worship for Jews. Okay, I'm not trying to insult you, I'm just trying to get you to think about it. Places of worship for Jews. So where did he go when he had a conversation with Jews? Where did he go to illustrate that Jesus was the Christ?
The Old Testament.
He went to the Old Testament. It's the only scriptures they've got, right? Okay, the New Testament's just being built. So I believe when he says that he showed from the scriptures, he's talking about the Old Testament scriptures. That's what was readily available to them. If you're talking to a Jew, then that's a great way to try to get them to see who Jesus is, right? You go back to their own heritage and you walk them through their own history and you show them how each step of the way they were walking themselves or pointing right to the fact that Jesus is exactly who the law and the prophets have been pointing to. How effective is that going to be with the Gentile who's never read the Old Testament? Not very, right? Or not nearly the same. Sometimes when you're defending the gospel, here's the point I'm trying to make. Sometimes when we defend the gospel, the first thing that we need to understand is who's our audience. Sometimes we try to defend the gospel from the wrong approach because we don't ever consider who the audience is. You at times, if somebody is completely lacks any understanding of New Testament, you may have to talk to them in one way. Maybe somebody has some kind of religious bias, and so you may have to speak to them in a different way. There's all kinds of audiences that the gospel needs to be defended to. And the same approach will not work with every audience. I know we like cookie-cutter approaches to things. We like to say, here's our cookie cutter, right? Here's our approach to the gospel, and we're just going to use that stamp with anybody and everybody that we ever encounter. And it won't work. It won't work. When you defend the gospel, you may have to defend it with folks who have a misunderstanding of it. You may have to defend it with folks who've never explored it at all. You may have to defend it from folks who come from other religious cultures. And we're not very many generations away, I don't believe, in our country where that's going to become more and more prevalent. Where we're defending Christianity not from the various, for lack of a better description, not from the various types of Christianity. I'm using that extremely accommodatively. You understand what I mean by that. Not from everybody coming from a Bible background. We're gonna be defending, I'm convinced anyway, over time. Maybe not as much in my life, but we're not very many generations away where we're going to be defending the gospel in this country more and more as it contrasts against other world religions. I mean, think about it. Those of you who are over 50, how many conversations have you had in your lifetime where you were defending the gospel against a completely different world religion? Anyone? No. In my lifetime, to my knowledge, as I recall, I believe I have only encountered one occasion where the conversation had to be about defending the gospel against a person in front of me who had a completely different religious background. But that's not going to be the case. So, here's the point. We're talking about apologetics. We're talking about defending the gospel. We're talking about being ready to give a defense. And the ability to give a defense in many ways is going to change over time, depending on who the audiences are. And we need to be ready for that. We've got to take a step back sometimes and ask ourselves, who am I talking to? Learn a little bit about them to know what their background is, where are they coming from. The truth of the matter is that you can't get anybody to point B if you don't know what first, where they're at. That's just a plain truth that has always been true. You can't get somebody to point B until you know where they're at in the moment. And so many times we try to convince people of where they need to get to without ever first thinking about where are they. Where are they? I went up to some of you may have ever been up to West Penn Hospital in Pittsburgh. One of the elders in Moundsville and I went up to visit a lady up there one time. And I can remember there was this phone on a desk. There was no person at the information desk. There was a phone there. And it said, if you need help, call this, pick up the phone, call this number. So call the number. And the lady said to me, where are you going? I told her where we were going. She said, follow the purple arrows on the floor. And I thought, arrows on the floor? And I'm looking on the floor. We considered ourselves intelligent individuals. We could not find purple, green, we couldn't find any arrow on the floor. And I kept saying, and the lady's like, now sir, for 5 minutes, now sir, please, fine. And then finally she said, wait, where are you? And I said, well, we came in from this spot and we walked in. She said, oh, you're going to have to go. She ever stopped to ask us where we were calling from in the hospital. There weren't any arrows on the floor where we were at. We had to go into a different area and then find the purple arrows, which were there, by the way, and make our way to where we were going. If you don't stop and figure out where somebody is, you can't help them to get where they're going. When you go to defend the gospel, take some moments, take some time. I know we see the urgency. I know we get ahead of ourselves sometimes. Take the time to figure out where they are. And it'll go a long way in defending the gospel in the right way. Paul said, I'm ready. I'm ready to get into the Scriptures with a house full of Jews. I'm ready to get into the Scriptures and walk them right up to where the Scriptures point them specifically to who Jesus is and what He's about. In Jude verse 3, we're to contend what? In what manner? Earnestly for what? The faith, which was how many times? That was once. Okay? Once for all delivered to the saints. Single source of information. A one-time event, if you will. One message with clarity. And we need to contend earnestly for that message and that teaching that Jesus has sent through His inspired writers.
You have brothers say that we're going to have to be defense of the gospel, but that's going on right now.
Yeah.
In the classrooms and schools. And I saw on the television here a couple of weeks ago where this girl went before the school board and was telling them why. The teacher wouldn't let her use the word God in the classroom. But all the other religions could use everything they had. She was denied to use the word God.
There is a distinct possibility, Tom, that we have done in America what we often do. We see what some deem to be an extreme.
Yeah.
And to fix the extreme, they flip what? They flip to another extreme. And so you can ignore the God of the Bible because He's already been emphasized too much over the generations. So we're going to, because we saw that as an extreme, we're going to create another extreme where you're right. That's the kind of thing that we're running into, where more and more the gospel is going to have to be defended in a variety of different ways among different audiences. And the truth is, in many ways, gone are the days where the 1950s approach toward spreading the gospel. I just don't think we're there. It's just not the same environment, and we've got to come to terms with that, or we're gonna lose the battle, if you will, of sharing the message of Jesus. In this process, then, if we're gonna defend the message, then at the heart of this is going to be a need for me to be completely persuaded. Have you ever had to defend something you really didn't believe in? And rarely that happens. But sometimes you run into that circumstance where you have to try to persuade somebody in something. And the truth is you're not even convinced of it. you're not even really a true believer in it. And how persuasive can you be when you're not so sure about it yourself? Yeah, it can't be, right? You'll use a lot of phrases like might be, could be, maybe, possibly. We'll use very vague kind of terminology when we're not so convinced ourselves. Sanctify, set apart the Lord of God in your own heart first, if we're going to convey the message as we should. To sanctify, he says, means to consecrate or set apart. New American Standard Version renders this phrase, but sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts. He's in charge. He's the Lord. He's been set apart. I think of Him above all others. And when we convince ourselves in that fashion first, then we'll be greater at encouraging others to become believers as well. I got to be fully committed first. And if I become fully committed first, then I'll be able to fulfill the purposes God has set before me to do that. Jesus in the proper frame, it'll happen. And with that, let's run to Hebrews 13 real quick. Our time's about up this morning. Hebrews chapter 13. Verse 5 again. He said, be ye free from the love of money, content with such things as ye have, for himself has said, I will in no wise fail thee, neither will I in any wise forsake thee. So that with good courage we say, the Lord is my helper, I will not fear. What shall man do unto me? It's that mindset that'll get us through. That kind of deep confidence that we have in Jesus that will allow us to, number one, be willing to defend Him, but number two, see the value. Again, we're not very persuasive when we don't see the real value in things. When we don't see the kind of value in something that brings a genuine purpose to us, there's not a lot of drive there to be very convincing about. When we commit ourselves to the value of what Jesus brings into my existence, then we're a lot more convinced about the need to share that message with others as well. So set Him apart, teaching Jesus is worthwhile, and being confident in that approach will benefit us as well. Last 30 seconds. Any thoughts or comments that you might have about that? I don't even want to start the next paragraph, because there it is. It wasn't even 30. Lord willing, we'll come back in Wednesday night, and we'll finish up this lesson together.